Thanks for inviting me into your home, your long haul truck, RV, camper, taxi, your parents' well appointed basement with the simulated wood paneling, electric fireplace, and the painting of dogs playing poker, your loft, that greasy spoon just off the interstate, and your cabin in the woods. Welcome to Coast AM, the very best in late night talk radio. I'm Richard Serrett, sitting in for George Norrie, and tonight, this morning, I'm coming to you live from Athens. Not Athens, Georgia, but Athens, Greece. Yes, I'm enjoying a little R&R over here mixed with some work and showing my brother around who's visiting from Toronto. And Athens, like any large city, can get noisy occasionally, so you may hear the odd motorcycle or a car alarm or a barking dog, although things should be a little quieter because today is a huge national public holiday in Greece. This is Ohi Day. Ohi is Greek for no, and it commemorates the day back on October the 28th, 1940, when the Greek Prime Minister Yannis Metaxas denied a request from Italian dictator Benito Mussolini that he allow Italian troops to enter Greece. Metaxas responded to the Italian ultimatum in French, the diplomatic language at the time, alors c'est la guerre, or then it is war. In the days following, the word of Metaxas' denial had spread around the capital, and the Greek population took to the streets shouting, Ohi, no. And his decision is commemorated each year as a day that represents bravery, solidarity, and heroism for millions of Greeks all around the world. Ohi, no. Happy Ohi Day. Coming up in the first half of Coast tonight. In August of 1964, the Beatles embarked on their first official tour of North America. John, Paul, George, and Ringo played a staggering 32 shows in 26 venues in 24 cities in just 33 days. Wow. In the process, the band turned the entertainment business on its ear and forever changed the landscape of the concert touring industry, with stops in LA's Hollywood Bowl, Colorado's Red Rocks Amphitheater, and venues from Chicago to New Orleans, Boston to Jacksonville, and Toronto. The group encountered total chaos in every city they played. They endured bomb threats, blackmail plots, teenagers who infiltrated their hotels dressed as maids, and even a prediction from a famous astrologer they would all die in a plane crash. Elaborate plans were drawn up to transport the Fab Four to hotels and venues. These included the use of ambulances, police paddy wagons, armored trucks, and in one case, an empty fish truck. The band would tour North America twice more in 1965 and 1966 before retreating from the chaos of life on the road to concentrate on breaking new ground in the recording studio. But those first three North American tours have been chronicled in a remarkable 2-volume coffee book collection titled Some Fun Tonight, the backstage story of how the Beatles rocked America, the historic tours of 64 to 66. The 2 hefty volumes provide readers with a city-by-city synopsis of the group's activities as they traveled the United States and Canada, and includes hundreds of photographs and images of rare memorabilia. It's truly the definitive reference for what is arguably the most important period in the Beatles' long and winding career. You'll hear about the behind-the-scenes negotiations, the mayhem at the airports and hotels, and the cheeky quotes delivered at the press conferences. You'll also read about the opening acts, the concerts, and the stories behind the shows through the eyes of the Beatles, their entourage, the promoters, the MCs, and, of course, the fans. Never before have the Beatles' North American concerts been covered in such depth, and author Beatles historian Chuck Gunderson joins me in hours 1 and 2. In the second half of Coast, open lines. And as always, it's a politics-free zone. No COVID, no war. Instead, a respite from the doom and gloom, and a celebration, or at the very least a chronicling, of your encounters with high strangeness. Ghosts, goblins, Bigfoot, dogmen, time slips, otherworldly craft, FaceTime with humanoids, bizarre synchronicities, and more. All right. If you didn't experience Beatlemania firsthand, you can relive the excitement next on Coast to Coast AM. Welcome to the Audio Imaginarium. Come on in, weary traveler. Hang your cloak on a peg, grab a stool, and come gather round the fire. There are stories to be told, and you are among friends. I'm Richard Serrett, sitting in for George Norrie, and this is Coast to Coast AM. Why don't you stay a while? Chuck Gunderson was raised in San Diego, the site of the Beatles' eighth stop on the 1965 North American tour. He was too young to attend the show, but fondly recalls his older siblings spinning the records of the Fab Four as he grew up, which perked a lifelong love for the band. He's also worked in the outdoor advertising industry most of his life, although his true passion is history, and he obtained his BA at San Diego State University and a master's at the University of San Diego, both in the field of history. Having published a few articles over the years, Chuck turned his sights to researching and writing the critically acclaimed Some Fun Tonight, the backstage story of how the Beatles rocked America, the historic tours of 1964 through 1966. He's consulted on a number of various Beatles-related projects, such as director Ron Howard's recent documentary 8 Days a Week. Chuck and his wife, Christina, live in Carlsbad, California. Parents of 4 children, each a self-described Beatles fan. Chuck Gunderson, welcome back to Coast. How are you?
Hey, Richard, how are you? Thanks so much for having me back on Coast. It's always great to be here, and I really appreciate the little reminder of Greek history. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Speaking of which, did the Beatles ever play in Greece?
No, they didn't. They never played in Greece, but they loved Greece. They visited it a few times.
That's right. There's a legendary story. There's a sandal maker in Athens whose name escapes me, but he was back in the 60s. Everyone came, all the celebrities came to his little sandal shop to have him make their sandals, and he made sandals for John Lennon. They still talk about it. They're very proud of that. So,
That's so interesting.
How did you track down all of these amazing photos, most of which I've never even seen before? Plus, there's all the images of the rare memorabilia. How did you track all this down? I mean, this could not have been an easy task.
Well, the whole book was such a difficult task to put together because, had the Beatles toured in the social media age, we could have had everything, photos and documents and all of that. The story, the Beatles would come to town. There might be a headline, that type of thing, and a column written, but very, very short. The photos were perhaps the hardest. I really had to do a lot of digging into archives, newspaper archives, and photo, research libraries, and people that had photos in their collection that were these shadowy figures I kind of had to track down. And what's interesting is I would find a photo in Denver, and they'd say, oh, yes, we have photos of them in Denver. And I'd get the photos sent to me, and that's not them in Denver. That's them in New York. So one of the things I learned in researching the book is that during that first tour, well, all the tours subsequently, is to follow the clothing. From the minute they get off the plane in, say, San Francisco in 1964, all the way until they get back on the plane in New York, at the end of September, is follow that clothing. You'll kind of figure out which city they're in. But when I published the book, I really wanted a lot of photos, and especially the ones that fans hadn't seen. Really rare stuff that, would have laid in a dusty archive somewhere until I unearthed it.
My understanding is that there was a pre-order on this 2-volume set, 4 of them, which leads us to presume that the pre-orders were from either the surviving Beatles or the families of the survivor, or the families of the 2 deceased Beatles.
Yeah, it was actually after the book was published, I got a very friendly note from the secretary at Apple, which is the Beatles company, and it was before Apple Computer, obviously. And the email said, hey, thanks for the book that you've written about the tours, and the 4 shareholders would like to have a copy. So obviously the 4 shareholders at the time were Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr, the wife of George Harrison, which was Olivia Harrison, and the late wife or the wife of John Lennon, the late John Lennon, Yoko Ono. So it was my pleasure to send those quote shareholders books, and I was able to include a note in each one. I don't know if they ever read it or not, but at least I included it in there, and it was a real great honor for me to know that they have those books.
So let's start with the '64 tour. Were as hard as it may be to believe now, looking at backwards at the monumental success at the time, were the Beatles at all reticent about this tour? Did they have any, I don't know, lingering doubts about how they'd be received by fans, whether they could pull this off?
I think the Beatles were very familiar with the progression that they were making. One of the hallmarks of the Beatles is they never wanted to stay in one place. They always wanted to progress. And I think this was just this natural progression of playing, the Cavern in Liverpool, which fit, whatever, 100 people, to, moving out of the Cavern and moving into dance halls in Liverpool. And you move from dance halls to small theaters in and around the UK. And, Brian Epstein, their manager, just kind of nourished them and kept them going. And it just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. But by the time they got to America in 1964, especially during that tour in August, when they faced that first crowd at San Francisco's Cow Palace, that was the largest crowd they had ever played to. It was about 18,000 people. And the largest crowd they had played to in the UK was about 8,000 people. Then they had gone down to Australia in June, and they played to a crowd of about 10,000 people. So they were just kind of going along, and it was getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and they were going along with it and just doing a great job, falling into place, doing what they needed to do. And the thing about the Beatles that I love is they're just such consummate professionals. They were willing to take on the challenges. They were willing to just do these really hard things that I think a lot of people would think would be, wow, I don't know if I can do this, to we're just going to go out there and do it. And apparently it went really well because the crowds responded well, and the concerts were mostly sold out on that first tour of 1964.
32 shows, 26 venues, 24 cities in just 33 days. And if you look at the itinerary, they're not sort of doing it by by region. They're not going up and down the East Coast and then traveling maybe across the South and then up Central, the Midwest and so forth. They're crisscrossing. They're going from east to west. They're bouncing all over the place. Why was the tour put together this way?
That's an interesting question, Richard. Brian Epstein received about a 6-page document from a company in New York called General Artists Corporation and their vice president, Norman Weiss. He was kind of the American contact that knew all the venues, the hotels, where they were going to play. He put together the support acts that would tour with them. And he presented this sheet to Brian, and actually I have the original copy of that, and it has Brian's check marks, his writing on it, his tea stains from his cup of tea as he was pondering over these different cities and venues that they would play at. And I actually present that in the book, all of it, in a very large format, so you can see every jot and tittle of Brian's thinking. And it is interesting that it was somewhat very haphazard. When the tour ended in the end of September, John Lennon spoke to a journalist. And he said, "We will never do a tour like that again." And they never did do another tour like that again. But the planning of it was somewhat strange because they started out in San Francisco, then they flew down south to Las Vegas, then they flew all the way north to Vancouver, then flew a little south to Seattle, and then flew all the way south again to the Hollywood Bowl in L.A. Then across over to Denver, and then over into the Eastern Seaboard. Sometimes I begin to think that Brian Epstein, he was a wonderful manager. He broke new ground. But sometimes I think he didn't realize how vast the United States, North America is, the United States and Canada, just how large it is, how much ground it covers. The Beatles could play a gig in south of Liverpool and go back there to the south of England and head back up to Liverpool, just driving around. And when they got to America, I mean, by the time they finished up the tour from London back to London, it was around 22,000 miles that they had traveled. So it was just this incredible journey. And sometimes they would do a concert, finish up a concert, and instead of staying the night in the hotel, they would get on the plane at 1 in the morning and fly for a couple of hours to the next city, landing in a city at 3 or 4 in the morning, and then be driven to the hotel and sleeping for a few hours, and then back to the venue. It was really quite just an amazing kind of thing that they had done.
Paint us kind of a mental picture of the reception they received from fans, either at the airport or outside their hotel, at the concert venue itself. I mean, we have this image, these legends about this chaos and the mob of fans that were out of control. Was it really like that?
Absolutely, it was a complete besiegement everywhere they went. I think they might have had the mistaken idea they could have gotten out and explored a city like New Orleans. They picked a city like Las Vegas to go and perform in, which was quite an interesting selection to even go to Las Vegas in 1964. It's not the Las Vegas we know of today, only 100,000 people living there. But everywhere they went, when they first got to San Francisco, there were 5,000 fans at the airport. And the promoters or the organizers of the concert had built a little kind of a welcome stage at the airport out in the field there, kind of off to the side of the runway. It was maybe like a 10 by 10. They put some cyclone fencing around it, and they were going to have the Beatles disembark from the airplane and come to this little podium and greet their fans. Well, they were only on there for about 30 seconds before they realized that we're going to have a real problem here, and the Beatles could be crushed to death. But anywhere they went, they could not get out of their hotel room. All they really saw of America was airports, hotels, venues. That was it. They just could not get around. There was a few places where they did get out just for a little bit of time, but there just wasn't much. Fans were besieging the hotels. They were trying to figure out ways to get in. They were climbing up drain pipes. They were coming in dressed as hotel maids or hidden in room service carts. Just any way they could get in to try to get a visit with the Beatles. It was just crazy pandemonium. I had the opportunity to stay at the Brown Palace Hotel in Denver about a month ago, where the Beatles were at. And I was actually in their room 60 years to the day that they were there. And it was fun for me just to look out the window and kind of imagine the crowds that were down below on the street at the Brown Palace, and how they just kind of surrounded the hotel. I actually had the hotel historian take me on the original route from when the Beatles got out of the limousine and went up the freight elevator to their rooms. It was just quite fascinating to kind of think that. But you're correct. It was absolutely everything that everyone would think about in terms of the fans and how much pandemonium and chaos there was.
Let's talk about the actual concerts themselves, individual concerts. I mean, it's not like today we've got, Bruce Springsteen or Paul McCartney today, even at the age of 80, will play close to 3 hours. I mean, they'll go through, 20, 25 or more songs. Maybe an opening act, maybe not. How many songs did they play? How long were they actually on stage for?
Yeah, so they're only on stage for between about 30 to 35 minutes. On the 1964 tour, the set list was 11 songs. That was it. So what the promoters would do, or General Artists Corporation that basically organized the tour, they would do about a kind of a 2-hour kind of package show where they would have 3 to 5 support acts come on before the Beatles, and then the Beatles would come out and close it out. But we have to remember, Richard, at this time in 1964, the rock and roll touring or concert industry was kind of being invented. Rock and roll exploded in the 1950s, mid 1950s, with Elvis and Little Richard and Chuck Berry and Carl Perkins and all those great artists. And Elvis, in the mid 50s, before he went into the Army, he did play some of the venues that the Beatles played in on the 1964 tour, like the Chicago's International Amphitheater. But Elvis
Chuck, sorry for the interruption. I got to jump in here because we got that music coming up. We're going to take a quick time out. Back with more of my conversation with Chuck Gunderson. Some fun tonight, the backstage story of how the Beatles rocked America. Back with more right here on Coast to Coast AM. And we are back with Chuck Gunderson, author and Beatles historian, talking about the Beatles North American Tour 1964, the 2-volume set. These are hefty tomes. A couple of months ago, I received mine, and I was watching with some amusement as the FedEx driver struggled to walk up the driveway. I mean, there are coffee table books, but these coffee table books could actually be coffee tables. But they're just required material for any true Beatles fan, and in fact, the remaining Beatles and the families of George Harrison and John Lennon, they've got their copies as well. Favorite photo in the book? I know that must be an impossible question since there are hundreds of them, but is there one that just keeps coming back to your mind, Chuck?
Absolutely. It's on my screensaver right now, as a matter of fact. But it's in the Denver chapter when they played there on August 26, 1964 at Red Rocks Amphitheater. It is. I actually took 2 pages of the book to present it because it was just this. It's this beautiful photo, and it's hard to get all four of them in a frame in a concert for some reason. And this one has all 4 of them in the frame. It's just this stunning blackness all around them. With that beautiful black and white photography. And all of them just look like they're having a great time. They're smiling. It's just, I know what note they're hitting, which song they're probably doing. And it just kind of captured that moment of Beatlemania in America when it was just so fresh, so new. Because when they do that final tour in '66, it was really becoming old hat to them. So that would be, if I had to choose one, I think that would be it.
When you say you know what note they're playing, what song they're singing, how can you tell what song they're playing?
Oh, I've watched every clip I could find of them in concert. It's just a labor of love for me. And there are actually people that are experts that will tell you, oh yes, in that photo they're playing this song because they're musicians. They're looking at the chords or whatever. I'm not a seasoned musician, but others are, and that are experts at it, and they can tell you.
So you mentioned the set list. They were on stage for like half an hour. They played probably less than a dozen songs, I think you said. Did the set list ever deviate? Was it the same, like 11 songs every night?
Pretty much the entire tour. There were only a couple cities where they might have added a song. But it was pretty much the core set was done in every city in the 24 cities on the 1964, and same with 65, and same with 66. And they got to the point in 65 and 66 where, and they might have had it in 64 as well, but they were taping the set list to their guitars. I don't know how they even saw the set list myself. They're written so small. I actually have one of them that's in a traveling exhibit that I'm involved with that was done on the back of a cigarette pack. It was taken off of George Harrison's guitar at the final show at Candlestick Park in August 66. Richard, it's 1 inch by 1 inch, and it has all 11 songs written on it.
Wow.
It's quite,
how did
quite
it sound?
stunning to see it in person.
I'll bet. How did they sound on stage? Because this is before, massive amplifiers, the wall of sound, venues that are, designed specifically for their acoustics. If we went to a concert, traveled back in time to '64, how would it sound?
Well, it was rudimentary back then. What if you go to a small venue now, a club even, where maybe 50 people are there? That band will have speakers on stage that point back to them, feedback speakers or foldback speakers, where it presents the music back to them where they kind of hear what they're playing. That technology wasn't invented yet in 1964, and even on their last tour in 1966, they still didn't have it. It wasn't, if the Beatles could have hung around until about 1969, they would have had a better sound system. But basically, when they got to an arena or a amphitheater or a stadium, they would basically hook the sound system into the public address system. So how the Beatles ever heard themselves, I'll never know. But this is when I go back to them being ultimate, consummate professionals. Their career didn't start in a sterile recording studio. They started their career on the rough and tumble stages of Liverpool and Hamburg, Germany. And they just knew how to play live. They knew each other's styles. They knew where each other was in the song. How Ringo ever filled that backbeat, I'll never know. Ringo has said many times that as he was watching them on stage, they would ask him, well, how would you know where they're at in the song? He said, I just watch them wiggle their butts. And I knew where they were at in the song, and I could do the fill there. But Ringo just kind of hanging on to that beat was quite an amazing feat when you're playing before thousands and thousands of people as they're touring around America. I mean, they're playing to crowds of, 20,000, 30,000, 40,000, and 65, they come back and they do that famous Shea Stadium show where they played before just over 55,000 people. So, but the stage amplification was just extremely rudimentary. Small amplifiers, not cranking out many watts. I think McCartney or Taylor Swift tours today, they might crank out, 300,000 watts. And I think back then they were trying to achieve about 5,000 watts. So you can see how difficult it was.
Talk to me about the opening acts, because they would have, like 3 or 4 bands come on before? Who were some of the notable opening acts?
Yeah, so one of the things I wanted to do in the book, Richard, was pay homage to the opening acts. A lot of people just kind of forgot that they even existed. A lot of people just thought you went and saw the Beatles and that was it. And they maybe played for 2 hours. Well, we know they didn't play for 2 hours. They played for 30 minutes, so they had to have some entertainment before that. But they had some amazing people that toured with them. In 1964, they had the Righteous Brothers. They had the Bill Black combo, which sadly Bill Black was the bass player for Elvis Presley, and he really wanted to be on that tour, but sadly he couldn't be on that tour. He was developing a brain tumor and was too sick to go, so he sent a replacement. Jackie DeShannon was on that tour. The Exciters, who had a great hit in 1963 called Go Tell 'Em. Clarence Frogman Henry. So it was really hard for these acts to go on. And the whole time they're on stage performing their music, the crowd was screaming, "We want the Beatles." And they were getting impatient. And the crowd was just really welling up and just wanting the Beatles to come. But these support acts just kind of soldiered on and did their slot that they had to do. So I really wanted to pay homage to them. I have pictures of them in the book, what they look like. They're kind of what they would have played in their set list, a little bit of history about them, because they really were in a tough spot, preceding the Beatles. And as a matter of fact, the Righteous Brothers on the 1964 tour, they only did about the West Coast swing of the tour. When they got over to New York, to the Forest Hills shows on August 28th and 29th, they were distracted by the Beatles helicopter coming over to drop them off at the Forest Hills Tennis Stadium because they're staying over in Manhattan. And all the Brownie cameras and all the screens went up to the helicopter. And they went to Brian Epstein after that show and said, look, we've kind of had this opportunity. There's a new show in L.A. called Shindig that we want to be on. And so Brian graciously let him out of the contract. So their last show was at that Atlantic City the next day, and then they were released and replaced by Clarence Frogman Henry.
Were the management, the agents for these opening acts or other musicians, were they like aggressively lobbying Brian Epstein to become a part of the tour, to become part of the opening act, thinking, if we get on with the Beatles, our career is just going to take off like a rocket ship on rails?
Possibly. They were more lobbying General Artists Corporation because they were the ones that kind of organized the tours. They were the ones that booked the chartered flight. They were the ones that booked the hotels. They were the ones that got the venues, and they were the ones that provided the support act. To put the Beatles in America in 1964 for all the hotels and all the expenses was just under $40,000 to do that. The Beatles cleaned up in America. They made over $1 million. So these support acts, they definitely wanted to be on this tour, because it would give them lots of exposure.
$1 million. What is that? What is that in today's money? Maybe 5-6 million?
Probably so. It's a lot of money. They did really well. And actually, the IRS came to them after the tour and extracted about $380,000 from them, claiming that they were an American entity. And the Beatles company, which was Brian Epstein's company, Northern, NEMS, they fought it and actually beat the IRS and got their money back with interest, which is kind of interesting. But, the Beatles, they were getting guarantees that were unheard of in America at the time, far more than the American stars of the day, like Frank Sinatra or Judy Garland or Liza Minnelli, who were getting about anywhere from $10,000 to $12,000 a night. The Beatles came in; they were getting between $25,000 to $30,000 a night. Plus, they were getting a percentage of the gate receipts. So they were absolutely cleaning up in America.
What about the ticket prices? What would a ticket to see the Beatles plus the opening acts at the Cow Palace set you back in 1964?
So the average price in 1964, believe it or not, was about $4.50 to go see the Beatles. The highest you'd pay is about $8.50 in a show at Kansas City, and the lowest you could have ever saw them for was about $1.50 to $1.95, somewhere around there, to go see the Beatles.
Unbelievable. There's also images of some of the rare memorabilia. You mentioned the set list that was taped to the back of their guitars. I don't know. Share some other images or describe some other images of some of the rare memorabilia. Some of the more unusual.
Yeah, so that's one of my favorite parts of the books is the documents that I presented. In a lot of books, they show them in a really small scale, hard to read. I almost took up a whole page of the book just to show a performance contract. I was lucky enough to find a treasure trove of documents as I was researching for this book, and I actually found all the performance contracts for the 1964 tour. Brian Epstein's, which I've previously mentioned, his 6-page document with all the cities, the venues, the ticket prices, and all his check marks. He was offered some crazy venues, huge venues of 70,000, 80,000 seats in 1964. So that's some of my favorite. I also show what the tickets look like. I mean, they're almost kind of works of art back then. Now you go to a concert, you go to your computer, the ticket shows up on your phone or whatever, and you go into the venue. Back then, they had to print the tickets, and sometimes they printed them with the Beatles' faces on them. I have images of handbills of some of the posters. There really wasn't a lot of posters that needed to be printed in America for any 3 Beatles tours because they didn't need to advertise. The tickets would usually go on sale in spring, and when they came around in the summer, most of the tickets were gone. So they really didn't need to advertise much. There isn't many examples of those. I also have correspondence. I have like a check that was presented to them after the Indiana State Fair for about $88,000. So that's a lot of the neat information that I was able to present in the book, and especially their contract writer. If Taylor Swift tours now, I'm sure her contract writer is probably 50 pages long that she, just wants this in the dressing room and the sound's got to be like this. And, she's got 100 trucks that brings everything in. When the Beatles toured, they could fit all the equipment in basically a stretch van, and their contract rider was only a page and a quarter. And in that, the only demands that the Beatles wanted were 4 cots, clean towels, mirrors in the dressing room, a portable TV set, and 2 cases of soda pop. That was it. It was just very archaic, very primitive, because, as we know, this whole rock and roll touring concert industry was kind of being invented on the fly by Brian Epstein at this time.
Right. Nothing in there about a bowl full of Smarties, but you must take out all the red ones.
Absolutely not. Nothing really crazy. I mean, really, as the writers went on, even in 1965 and 1966, they went from a page and a quarter to a page and a half. And basically, the wants in 65 and 66 were more security. They had learned a lot in 1964. There wasn't even a backstage pass invented back then. They had no idea who was backstage, who was invited, who wasn't invited, who was who. So they learned when they came back in 1965 to kind of print this white pass, which was an identification pass that the support acts had, that some of the DJs that were touring with them were able to have. And then even in 1966, they went a step further and they printed a red pass, which was really for the inner circle. Now, the Beatles didn't have to have red passes, but even Brian Epstein had a red pass, so he could get past the security to be able to get into the inner circle. So just completely primitive and being invented as it was going along.
Chuck Gunderson, Some Fun Tonight, the backstage story of how the Beatles rocked America, the historic tours of 64 to 66. We'll take a timeout, top of the hour, back with more of our conversation right after this timeout, right here on Coast to Coast AM.